Some criticisms of Marxism. Part 1. The labor theory of value is drastically flawed. Marxist economic theory is built upon the foundation of the labor theory of value. Karl Marx, in his book Das Kapital, makes the argument that all value is derived from, quote, homogeneous human labor, unquote. This homogeneous human labor is, quote, measured by its duration in labor time, unquote, but more specifically, quote, the labor time socially necessary to produce an article under the normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time, unquote. Marx uses various terms to explain various forms of value: use value, exchange value, surplus value. Yet Marx is rather vague about what value actually is. In Marx's parlance, value is almost entirely rendered in economic terms. Lenin, trying to clarify these forms of value, writes specifically of commodities. Lenin writes, quote, a commodity is, in the first place, a thing that satisfies a human want. In the second place, it is a thing that can be exchanged for another thing. The utility of a thing makes is a use value. Exchange value, or simply value, is first of all the ratio, the proportion in which a certain number of use values of one kind can be exchanged for a certain number of use values of another kind. Their common feature is that they are products of labor, unquote. However, value is not necessarily restricted to the realm of economics. The Oxford Dictionary defines value as, quote, 1, the regard that something is held to deserve, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something. 1.1, the material or monetary worth of something. 1.2, the worth of something compared to the price paid or asked for it, unquote. While this definition contains economic aspects, it is not the full extent of the definition, nor is it the primary aspect of the definition. Indeed, examples utilizing the primary definition of the term do much to discredit the labor theory of value. For instance, what is the value of a child's art project? Perhaps to the director of an art gallery, it would not even be worth looking at. Yet to that child's mother, that art project may be of infinite value. What is the value of a family heirloom? Perhaps if a grandson were to take his grandfather's favorite bauble to a pawn shop, it may be worth $10, if that. Yet the grandfather valued it so highly that he kept it for decades and bequeathed it to his grandson. What is the value of a personal journal? To a literary agent, it may not be worth much, but to a person in their old age or to their children, that journal may be of utmost importance. There are, of course, many other examples that would fit into the first definition of value, yet do not necessarily fit into the economic definition. More such examples will be explored later in this video. Suffice it to say here that value is not necessarily economic. Marx observes, quote, an object may have a price without having value, unquote. This, of course, begs the question, can something have value without having a price? This is completely left out of Marxist analysis of value. At the very beginning, the Marxist theory has been given a terrible blow. The fact that Marx is incredibly vague about what value actually is. Regardless, Marx asserted that value was derived from the amount of labor put into a given object. Marx writes in Das Kapital, quote, the greater is the labor time required for the production of an article, and the greater is its value, unquote. The entirety of Marxism is built upon the foundation of the labor theory of value. To be fair to Marx, however, he was not alone in this presupposition. Both Adam Smith and David Ricardo, among other classical economists, regarded labor as the source of value. According to Marx, all commodity values come from labor. Even the money that is used in market exchanges is derived from labor time. Marx writes, referring to the gold standard, quote, the value, or in other words, the quantity of human labor contained in a ton of iron, is expressed in imagination by such a quantity of money commodity as contains the same amount of labor as the iron." Unquote. Oftentimes, when people engage in criticism of Marxist labor theory of value, will bring up objections along the lines of, what is the value of a mud pie? If a child in their backyard works for hours making mud pies, what is the value of those mud pies? However, this objection is not entirely fair as a critique of Marxist labor theory of value. Marx is very careful to note that what he is referring to is, quote, socially necessary, unquote, labor, to create economic value, quote, under normal conditions, unquote. Marx writes, quote, "It becomes necessary that the labor should be carried on under normal conditions. If a self-acting mule is the implement in general use for spinning, it would be absurd to supply the spinner with a distaff and spinning wheel. Socially necessary," unquote. In this regard, Marx is referring to what he calls socially productive and socially necessary labor. However, this begs the question of why precisely the mud pies are left out. What exactly is it that makes certain labor socially productive or socially necessary? Even within the Marxist context, labor itself is not the basic component of value. Marx, by discussing socially productive and socially necessary labor, implies or outright states that it is capital investment that allows for the workers' labor to be productive. However, throughout Marx's work, he completely disregards the role of the entrepreneur and the capitalist play in the creation of value in a business. Indeed, Marx refers to the capitalists as parasites, driven by werewolf hunger. According to Marx, these persons, far from adding value, are actively exploiting the workers. This is due to the creation of surplus value. According to Marx, surplus value is, quote, "the difference between the value of the product and the value of the elements consumed in the formation of that product," unquote. Because a product or a commodity is sold at a higher price than it costs to produce it, therefore a surplus value has been added. According to Marx, this surplus value originates in the worker himself and is exploited by the capitalist. The worker creates this surplus, and yet the owner is the one who reaps the benefit. Marx writes, quote, "The worker creates no value for himself. He creates surplus value, which, for the capitalist, has all the charms of a creation out of nothing," unquote. The capitalist engages in this exploitation for his own personal gain, regardless of the consequences for his workers or for the society as a whole. Marx writes, quote, "Capital cares nothing for the length of life of labor power," unquote. Nor does the capitalist care for ethics, according to Marx. All that matters is his profits. Quote, "All bounds of morals and nature and sex and age, day and night, were broken down," unquote. Indeed, in this exploitation, there is no essential difference between capitalism and slavery, according to Marx. Quote, "The essential difference between the various economic forms of society, between, for instance, a society based on slave labor and one based on wage labor, lies only in the mode in which this surplus labor is in each case extracted from the actual producer, the laborer," unquote. According to Marxism, the only thing that adds value to products, commodities, or to businesses at large are the workers. The entrepreneurs and capitalists add nothing. However, this form of analysis and this conception of value completely and utterly disregards the concepts of risk and time preference. The entrepreneur engages in assuming risk in establishing her business, risks that her employees do not assume. In envisioning her business, the entrepreneur needs to identify a market need for the service she wishes to provide. Usually, she engages in market research in order to identify this need, or even in innovating a new product or service that she believes that would fulfill the needs of her customers. With her market research in hand, the entrepreneur then starts working to get funding for the venture. Either she will court investors and make arguments for why her business will be successful, Or the entrepreneur will get a loan from a bank for which she will be personally liable for. Or she will fund the venture with her own savings. Or she will utilize a combination of the three. In any case, if her business fails, she will either lose face before her investors, who will be less likely to work with her in the future, or she will still owe vast sums to the bank, or her own personal finances will be in ruins. No matter the scenario, in just establishing the firm, the entrepreneur is assuming risks her employees are not. When she sets up her business, she then needs to secure a location from which to do business. During her market research, she has identified what kind of location she needs to look for. If she is renting a space, then she is entering into contracts with landlords for which she is personally liable, or if she can't afford it, she may even build her own building. Regardless, she is responsible to pay for the utilities, heat, AC, electricity, water, internet, etc., as well as various kinds of insurance, renters, fire, flood, safety, etc. Or perhaps she decides that her business would be best done online, in which case she needs to purchase a domain name and either build a website herself or hire a web designer to help her. Regardless, she is assuming risks that her employees are not assuming. The entrepreneur will very likely need assistance in providing her goods and services. As a result, she will likely need to hire employees. Hiring is a risky and time-consuming process. It is especially risky when one considers that around 25% of new employees will quit within their first 6 months. Furthermore, the average cost of hiring a new employee is around $4,000. This is an inherent cost besides the employee's salary. The entrepreneur is taking a risk in hiring employees in the hopes that they will be skilled and committed enough to help the business grow. When she starts her business, the entrepreneur can expect that her business will not make a profit for at least 2 to 3 years. During that time, the entrepreneur cannot expect a paycheck. She will have to live on her savings and hope that her business does not fail. Meanwhile, her employees are the only ones getting paid. Otherwise, they would quit and find different jobs. On average, it costs upwards of $30,000 to start a new business. Even then, there are no guarantees. 20% of businesses fail within their first year. 50% of businesses fail within 5 years. 70% of businesses fail within 10 years. In some way, Marx acknowledges the risk that the entrepreneur is taking. Marx writes, quote, "Nobody can live upon future products or upon use values in an unfinished state," unquote. In this very direct sense, Marx is correct. The entrepreneur is assuming the risk of investing in these use values in an unfinished state, and in so doing is providing employment and a paycheck to her employees. This delay in reward is directly tied to the concept of time preference. Time preference, put simply, deals with, quote, people's preference to spend in the present over the future, unquote. In essence, the entrepreneur is willing to wait longer for a higher reward, whereas the employee is receiving a smaller reward in the here and now. Throughout this entire process, the entrepreneur is assuming risks that the employees will not or cannot assume. If the business fails, the employees can walk away, yet the entrepreneur may have her life ruined. All of this directly belies the Marxist contention of exploitation. The workers are not exploited by the capitalist entrepreneur. In a kind of irony, Marx verges on making this observation. Marx writes, quote, "But with whether the material factors of the process are of normal quality or not depends not upon the laborer, but entirely upon the capitalist," unquote. Marx here is acknowledging that the capital goods the laborer uses to make the products must first be created and maintained by the capitalist. This assertion that value is only added by the worker directly connected to the production of a product, and that the surplus value is necessarily evidence of exploitation, applies not just to the capitalist entrepreneur, but to a variety of other professions. Marx, in particular, focuses upon what he calls idle capital. bankers, merchants, and other forms of so-called middlemen are parasites in Marx's eyes. This is partly because, according to Marx, all exchanges, quote, must be the exchange of equivalents, unquote. In this way, since the merchant or shopkeeper charges more than what he purchased a good for, ergo, the merchant is exploiting his customers. Marx writes in Das Kapital, quote, as capitalist, I buy commodities from A and sell them again to B. The whole series was superfluous and nothing but hocus pocus. That for the future B would buy direct from A and A sell direct to B. Thus, the whole transaction would be reduced to a single act, forming an isolated, non-complemented phase in the ordinary circulation of commodities, a mere sale from A's point of view and from B's a mere purchase. The middleman leads to a creation of surplus value, unquote. Marx is asserting that not only are all capitalists parasitic middlemen, but particularly shopkeepers and merchants are parasitic middlemen. He is asserting that they add no value because farmers A and B could exchange with one another directly without the merchant sticking his nose in the process. The merchant is exploiting both farmers, according to Marx, for his own benefit without adding any value to the products. Marx writes, quote, it would appear that merchant's capital is an impossibility. So long as equivalents are exchanged, the merchant who parasitically shoves himself in between them, the producers being simply cheated. What we have said with the reference to merchant's capital applies still more to moneylenders' capital, unquote. However, Marx's assessment of these middlemen is extremely short-sighted. In his own example, A is growing wheat and B is producing wine. The odds of A and B directly knowing one another is rather low, particularly in an increasingly complex society. As such, the odds of A and B being able to find one another and of having a double coincidence of wants to engage in a barter exchange are also low. The value of the middleman shopkeeper is that he acts as a more centralized location wherein goods from various producers can be concentrated. If A wants to buy wine, he does not need to seek out B and hope that B has the kind of wine A wants. A can go to the shopkeeper with knowledge that the store will have a variety of wines. The same applies for B's wants. Furthermore, the shopkeeper acts as an agent of quality assurance. He has an incentive to make sure that the products he sells to his customers are of value. As such, he has an incentive to make sure he buys from reliable suppliers. The shopkeeper, far from being a parasite, helps to make sure that A and B can save their time and be relatively guaranteed of quality products. This value the shopkeeper provides is only multiplied as an economy becomes more complex. In order to perpetuate his dogma, Marx completely discounts the importance of the middleman he abhors. The Marxist conception is further undermined by the fact that Marx completely ignores services. Marx's entire conception of value is focused solely upon commodities. Throughout Das Kapital, Marx solely refers to physical products in his analysis. In one section, Marx writes, quote, capital is money, capital is commodities. Value is here the active factor in a process in which, while constantly assuming the form and term of money and commodities, unquote. In another section, Marx asserts that, quote, exchange is a social circulation of matter, unquote. This trend of only referring to commodities is replete throughout the book. Of course, in not acknowledging services, it begs the question, do services have value in the Marxist sense? What is the value of a massage? What value does a therapist or a teacher have? Considering that Marx is only referring to workers directly connected to the production of goods as the source of economic values, does it not follow then that every worker who is not directly connected to production of goods is merely a parasite? Do truck drivers, cashiers, baristas, tutors, accountants, lawyers, programmers, diving instructors, ski instructors, bus drivers, delivery people, garbage men, landscapers, among thousands of other professions add value? From Marx's definitions and his emphasis upon physical commodities, it would seem that these persons should be considered parasites, along with the capitalist, the banker, and the shopkeeper. Given that the post-industrial economies have been shifting towards service sector-based economy, it truly begs the question: in the 21st century, who is the proletariat? According to Marxists, the proletariat are, quote, that class in society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor power and does not draw a profit from any kind of capital, unquote. In other words, the proletariat do not own the means of production, but rather are employees. In a sense, this would include service sector workers, although it must be noted that Marx disregards them throughout Das Kapital. However, this definition would also include CEOs. As Serge Levitsky notes in his introduction to Das Kapital, quote, the rapid growth and extension of joint stock companies have all but eliminated the individual capitalist owner who was the prime target of Marx's attacks. The tycoon has been replaced by the professional manager who does not own the capital, unquote. Given these observations, either Marxist economics is deeply flawed because it does not acknowledge services as key values in any economy, or it must acknowledge that services are likewise have value. Yet, in order to maintain Marxist contentions about the labor of workers creating value, and there being different forms of labor, Marxism must further acknowledge that the entrepreneur, the banker, the shopkeeper, and the CEO all add value as well. No matter how it is parsed out, Marxism is deeply flawed in this regard. Marxist conceptions of value are quite obstinate, often only referring to use value or productive value as being actual economic value. Because of this obstinance, Marxism disregards entire sectors of the economy or discounts non-traditional use values. For one thing, Marx rather boldly declares that, quote, value exists only in articles of utility, in objects. If therefore an article loses its utility, it also loses its value, unquote. Marx here is only considering the utility of objects in determining their value. What then, according to Marxism, is the value of an antique? What is the value of a Ming vase or a Victorian grandfather clock? What is the value of a historical artifact? Why is it that Elvis's guitar is priced higher than an average guitar? According to Marx, none of these things have value due to the fact that they are no longer useful, so-called. This, of course, also begs the question, utility to whom? Does everyone have the same sense of utility? Given that Marx is making the assertion regarding products, it follows that he would apply such a standard to methods of production as well. There are many examples of groups maintaining antiquated forms of traditional products and forms of production in order to maintain cultural heritages. Many Native American tribes often partake in the production of traditional native jewelry and sell these items to tourists. In many ways, the process of creating this jewelry is a key part of maintaining their cultural identity. Similarly, Indians throughout the 20th century have attempted to maintain their traditional methods of weaving, also to maintain their culture. With Marx's conception of value, these considerations are ignored. In another bold statement, Marx writes, quote, the price of uncultivated land, which is without value because no human labor has been incorporated in it, unquote. Given this assertion, what then is the value of a game preserve? What is the value of a natural park? According to Marx, the Grand Canyon or Zion National Park are without value because they are uncultivated. Given the trend of the environmentalist movement around the world for the last 5 decades, what would the value of uncultivated land be to an environmentalist? Even outside of the context, oftentimes farmers leave fields to remain fallow for a few years in order to regenerate the nutrients of the soil, thereby making future uses more productive. Yet, according to Marx, it is axiomatic that uncultivated land is without value. Throughout these critiques of Marxist economic theory, Marxists may attempt to rebut by saying that these criticisms are reliant upon market prices reflecting actual value. Indeed, many Marxists will claim that the labor theory of value is only referring to equilibrium prices and not market prices. Furthermore, according to many Marxists, the labor theory of value should only apply to freely reproducible goods. This distinction between market prices and equilibrium prices, especially in the Marxist context, is largely made in order to maintain the structure of the ideology. As has been demonstrated in this section, the labor theory of value is key in demonstrating exploitation, which in turn is the keystone of all Marxist theory. If it was true that market prices accurately reflected the value of goods, then exploitation would largely be destroyed as a concept. However, given fluctuations in supply and demand, equilibrium prices are not particularly useful for observing real-world behavior. This problem is only compounded as economies become more complex and as substitutes become available. Furthermore, the emphasis upon freely reproducible goods undermines the usefulness of the theory drastically. What is meant by freely reproducible goods are goods that do not necessarily exist in a monopoly. No one baker has a monopoly on the recipe for wheat bread. No one clothing line has a monopoly on a plain white shirt. These are products that almost anyone can make and compete in the market. This, of course, begs the question: what is the value of a Rembrandt painting? A product that contains within it hours of labor and yet is not freely reproducible. According to this contention, the Rembrandt painting's value cannot be determined by the labor theory of value. Of course, Rembrandt paintings are not the only things being left out in this consideration. What is the value of a video game? Why is it that relatively simple games on cartridges often fetch extremely high prices? Why is it that a copy of 1995's Earthbound can vary from $200 to $2,000 when the game is arguably antiquated? Meanwhile, Bethesda Studios' 2018 title, Fallout 76, saw its price drop precipitously. Similarly, what is the value of any given film? What is the value of The Room as opposed to The Shawshank Redemption? Or the value of music? What is the value of a rap album to someone who exclusively listens to country? What is the value of a novel or a nonfiction book? What is the value of a YouTube video? What is the value of this YouTube video? What is the value of a football game or any kind of sport? What is the value of a sports team shirt? None of these items can be accounted for in the labor theory of value, and yet one would be hard-pressed to declare that they have no value at all. The Marxist labor theory of value completely ignores vast swaths of the economy. In a debate on YouTube, two users debated the merits of the labor theory of value. YouTube user The Academic Agent summarized this gap in a rather pithy way. The Academic Agent said to his opponent, quote, "So your theory can't do the Manchester United shirt," unquote. This particular topic blows massive holes into the side of the labor theory of value and of Marxist ideology. Regardless of these observations, Marx himself in Das Kapital often equivocates between equilibrium prices and market prices. Marx frequently uses money and money prices as a shorthand in describing a product's value. For instance, in one section, Marx writes, quote, "The commodity that functions as a measure of value is money," unquote. Elsewhere, Marx writes, quote, "The value of a commodity is expressed in its price before it goes into circulation, and is therefore a precedent condition of circulation, not its result," unquote. Later, Marx further equivocates when he writes, quote, "The commodity contains a quantity of the worker's labor, that quantity being measured by a definite social standard. This quantity is expressed by the value of the commodity, and since the value is reckoned in money of account, this quantity is also expressed by the price." Unquote. Marx repeatedly uses money prices as a means of describing value. He does this over and over and over again. Besides these observations, it should be noted that even with freely reproducible goods, Marx makes a huge assumption that the labor involved in and of itself imbues it with value. What is the value of a wool sweater in the middle of the desert? In that same desert, if someone was struggling to survive, what is the value of a bottle of water to that person? What is the value of a slice of bread after someone is full? What is the value of a beer to a Mormon or a Muslim? What is the value of a pork chop to an Orthodox Jew? What is the value of a cigarette to a cancer survivor? These are a few reasons why the labor theory of value, particularly in the Marxist sense, is at least not useful and at most completely irrelevant in describing real-world behavior. Considering the Marxist predilection to calling itself scientific, it would be necessary for it to accurately describe real-world behavior. This being said, Marx comes very close to a truth before brushing it aside. Quote, "Exchange is a transaction by which both sides gain." Unquote. Here, Marx comes very close to identifying the subjective theory of value. Quote, "The idea that an object's value is not inherent and is instead worth more to different people based on how much they desire or need the object." Unquote. The subjective theory of value is far more useful and accurate way of observing real-world behavior. The various rhetorical questions that were posed throughout this video, what is the value of a Rembrandt, what is the value of a film or a video game, what is the value of services, etc., can all be accurately answered with using the subjective theory of value. By acknowledging that different people have different preferences at different times, the subjective theory of value helps us to understand real-world economic behavior as well as make relatively accurate predictions. None of this can be said about the labor theory of value. Marxist economics is built upon the labor theory of value, which in turn builds up Marx's case that the capitalists are unjustly exploiting the proletariat. Marx, in his own way, summarizes his critique of capitalism in a rather succinct manner. Marx writes, quote, "Capitalism has the following results. 1. That the product belongs to the capitalist, not the laborer. 2. That the value of this product comprises a surplus value over and above the value of the advanced capital. This surplus value has cost the laborer labor, but the capitalist nothing. Yet it becomes the lawful property of the capitalist. 3. That the laborer has reproduced his labor power and can sell it once more if he finds a buyer for it." Unquote. One will note the level of importance that these points derive from exploitation and the labor theory of value. Considering the importance of this concept to the entire ideology, if this central premise is flawed, it follows that the rest of the ideology is irredeemably flawed. Marx does not adequately define what value is. Besides this, he does not recognize that values change for particular persons at particular times. He does not recognize that different people have different preferences. Marx's economic theory does not consider vast swaths of the economy. Entire economic sectors are simply ignored. Marx does not acknowledge that the value that is added by services, let alone the value added by shopkeepers, entrepreneurs, and bankers. Marx does not acknowledge the value of art, music, stage, film, novels, or entertainment in any form. Marx does not acknowledge the value of historical artifacts or antiques, nor does he take into account products of cultural importance. Marxist economics insists that the value of products are imbued inherently in the products themselves by the labor put into them. And yet, at every turn, vast categories of labor are ignored or excluded. By any measure, the labor theory of value is deeply flawed, so much so that it is hardly scientific, let alone useful as a framework of economic analysis. Besides aspects of the labor theory of value, Marx makes a number of statements that are quite baffling when considering the study of economics. One statement about the relationship between commodities and currency is particularly baffling. Quote, "The quantity of the medium of circulation is determined by the sum of the prices that have to be realized. If now we further suppose the price of each commodity to be given, the sum of the prices depends on the mass of commodities in circulation. If the mass of commodities remain constant, the quantity of circulating money varies with the fluctuations in the prices of those commodities. It increases and diminishes because the sum of the prices increases or diminishes in consequence of the change of price. To produce this effect, it is by no means requisite that the prices of all commodities should rise or fall simultaneously. A rise or fall in the prices of a number of leading articles is sufficient in the one case to increase in the other to diminish the sum of the prices of all commodities, and therefore to put more or less money in circulation. Whether the change in the price correspond to an actual change of value in the commodities, or whether it be the result of mere fluctuations in market prices, the effect on the quantity of the medium of circulation remains the same." Unquote. Given that prices are measured by money, how can the prices themselves control how much money is in circulation? This is assuming that inflation is entirely a market phenomenon and that metals are the only form of currency. Quote, "Coining is the business of the state." Unquote. It is also like saying that the number of fish in the sea determine how much water there is. Certainly, it has an effect, but not to the degree that Marx would imply. Furthermore, Marx frequently relies upon hyperbolic statements in order to put forward his point, as well as to attack the bourgeoisie he so hated. He often refers to them in dehumanizing fashion, referring to them as vampires or werewolves, without any sense of morality and only caring about their own greed. Marx frequently equates industrial labor with slavery. In one section, Marx writes, quote, "The capitalist buys children and young persons under age. He has become a slave dealer." Unquote. Connected to these instances of hyperbole, one should note that Marxist economic analysis largely started with its conclusion before attempting to find its evidence. This can be demonstrated by the fact that Marx's scientific opus, Das Kapital, was published 19 years after the Communist Manifesto was published. The political program came first and then was later justified by an economic treatise 2 decades later. While Marx wrote extensively about the supposed contradictions of capital, there are far more contradictions in his economic analysis.